I always wonder when we sing Patty Griffin songs here if we really need a sermon. Her music is definitely a cathedral that I return to. But I'm going to do it anyway. So you've probably heard it plenty around these UU circles. And maybe you even said it a few times yourself. I'm spiritual, but not religious. Recognize this phrase? But are you? I mean, you may actually be more religious than you are spiritual. If your main act of faith is showing up here for worship each Sunday, then, and by the way, that's an act of faith I do not mean to diminish in any way. It is a worthy act, especially since this is, after all, the best place to be in Atlanta on a Sunday morning. But if that is your act, then I would argue that is actually a religious act. And if you consider yourself to be spiritual, well, what does that actually look like as a Unitarian Universalist? How does that manifest in your life? And I find this question more imperative than ever in 2018, when so many of our American and even our world institutions are crumbling, or at least shifting dramatically, when our civil rights are becoming severely threatened, when our leaders threaten to take us back to the 1950s or earlier, to a time when greatness was a luxury afforded to a few wealthy white Christian heterosexual Americans, and the rest of us had to fight over the scraps of justice. We are living in a time when freedoms are being dismantled one by one before our eyes. First, a Muslim ban, and now my Iranian friend can no longer take her toddler to visit with his extended family, with his grandparents. And then an intensifying long-term separation and internment for refugees, although that word is being regularly interchanged now with the word immigrant. Assumptions of financial progress based on education or income are fading into deferred dreams for more and more of us. When student loans and rampant racialized gentrification and stagnant incomes jeopardize the aspirations of my generation. You know what I'm talking about? Yes. When all of this is stripped away, and if we no longer have access to quality health care, to reproductive rights, to safe drinking water, to affordable home ownership, to the luxury of border crossing, well, what will be left? My friends, what will be left? What will remain, I will tell you now, is our relationships. Relationships, your relationship to the self, relationship with God or the divine or faith, relationship with our first sacred UU source, which is wonderment, relationship with our ancestors and a sense of legacy, and finally, relationships with each other, with our families and community. That's what will be left. And so as spiritual people, how do we tend to those relationships? Now, in addition to all of this madness and chaos outside of our walls, I know there is so much anxiety too about our move, this community's move to a new location. Fear that we are walking right up to the canyon's edge. But make no mistake, you are not a member of 1911 Cliff Valley Way. That is not the name of your church. You are not a worshiper of this room. You hear me? It's what we have found within us that keeps us returning here. It's the sacred mysteries we have unlocked here, inside this room, and then further within, inside of ourselves. We are pretty good at being Unitarian Universalists on Sunday mornings. But I am concerned with how we practice our faith the other 6 days of the week, outside this walls. And when we get new walls, I will still be interested in what is happening outside of those walls. You see, the true test of religious practice, of spiritual discipline in your life, is not when things are fine, generally. It's not when we can claim evidence that our individual life plans will most likely work out well in succession as they were meant to. It's not when our collective destiny appears to be following a moral arc, bending eternally towards justice, although it is, but not always when it appears to be. But during those times of contentment, we might still attend church to deepen our lives through meaningful service, to see our friends. But when times are good, devotion and discipline become merely interesting concepts to study until things fall apart. Until catastrophe hits your family and you suddenly realize that what was a habit is actually a crippling addiction. Until you lose your job mid-career and the future feels more like the edge of a cliff than a comfortably designed ascending ramp. Until you receive a major life-altering diagnosis. Until your life is critically devalued by your own country's laws and enforcement. Suddenly, UU faith takes on a very different tenor. Under threat of safety and security, our Unitarian Universalist faith is a bridge. It is the bridge to our survival, towards hope for better days. And so I have used these central relationships as a frame for a UU practice, a devotion that can be your bridge. So first, let us explore how we might practice tending to a relationship with self. In his book, Fear, the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh writes that when the Buddha was very old, just before he died, he said, "My dear disciples, do not take refuge in anything outside of you. In every one of us, there is a very safe island you can go to. And every time you go home to that island with mindful breathing, that's how you get there. You create a space of relaxation, concentration, and insight. And if you dwell on that island in yourself with your mindful breathing, you are safe. That is a place where you can take refuge whenever you feel fear, uncertainty, or when you feel confused." Thich Nhat Hanh calls this mindfulness of breathing the energy of Buddha mindfulness. And he says we are capable of generating this energy ourselves. He compares it to the Christian experience of the Holy Spirit, described as the energy of God. And as the Buddha died, he himself returned to his mindful breathing, teaching from his deathbed that though his disciples were concerned they would lose their teacher, that they should look to the teacher within. Now, as an extrovert, I fear islands. I do not love islands, and so I have to say the idea of an island within does not appeal to me. I like to think of it instead as an altar within. It's an altar that you can populate with your dreams, your prayers, and your sympathies. An altar, a table for ritual. The original meaning of altar is a place where things are burned. And I see something there, burning, bright. So besides centering Buddha breath, another devotional tool for UUs is to create a mantra. I wonder if anyone has already done this in their lives. Does anybody have a mantra? All right, a couple of you. Mantra, often in pastoral care encounters, when I'm talking with someone after listening to their stories of suffering, I will ask how they have survived it. What gets you through? I'll ask. And often I'll invite the person to consider adopting a mantra to help generate calming energy during a challenging moment. The earliest mantras were composed in Vedic Sanskrit by Hindus in India. They are at least 3,000 years old. Mantras now exist today in various schools of Hinduism and Buddhism. They are repetitive, concise, they can be melodic. They express a human longing towards the spiritual. They can feel like a devotional prayer, like a spoken rosary. Some of the most trying moments of my years living in New York City were spent on the overcrowded subway during my morning and evening commute. Stuffed all together across ethnicities and generations in shockingly intimate spaces and intimate ways, those were the moments when humanity became the most difficult to love. When I really wrestled, I had a seminary professor who had a twice daily subway practice of looking at each and every person on the subway car just for 1 second and repeating to himself a variation from John's Gospel, I am in you, and you are in me, and we are in God. That mantra released him from the downward pull of judging others, judging everyone around them and how much space they took up. It released his narcissistic concern of his own comfort above all else in those moments. I had another friend who years ago was healing from a traumatic incident that happened to her, and she developed a mantra of protection from intruding, terrifying thoughts. Hers was simple. I am love. And it got her through. It got her through each moment of terror to the next, and then each day. Now, I do not know what your mantra is, but I know that if you can meditate on a mantra and find one that holds power for you, and you can take it out of your spiritual toolbox in those moments when you need it the most. The next relationship we must tend to, our relationship with the divine, or with our faith. And so I ask you, where is your chalice at home? Where do you keep your at-home chalice? You know, you all have an at-home chalice. You each all have a, yeah? Is it at your dinner table? Is it at your fireplace mantle? This is actually an ice cream bowl, but you know what? It's also a chalice. And you can have one. I grew up a Unitarian Universalist preacher's kid, but you would never know it by the way we lived. We did not grow up praying or saying grace at mealtimes, nor did we discuss the interdependent web of all existence, nor did we regularly share stories from the world's sacred texts. And I mention those 3 practices because I believe they are the least we should all be doing as we live into our UU faith in our lives. Truly. You laugh, but I actually think this is possible. Each evening at dinner, I invite you to gather around a chalice. It could just be an ice cream bowl with a candle in it, but light it. Say some chalice lighting words. You could say the words that we say each Sunday morning in our worship. Or you could say some other words from our hymnal. Or you could say the words that we will be saying at the close of our children's worship in the fall. We are people of open minds, loving hearts, and helping hands. Open minds, loving hearts, and helping hands. Blessed be. Or a Buddhist blessing. I know a Unitarian family who does this blessing each night at dinner. May I be happy, may I be healthy, may I be peaceful, may I be true. And then you say it a second time and you look at each other and say, may you be happy, may you be healthy, may you be peaceful, may you be true. And then the third time we say it again, all together, may all beings be happy, may all beings be healthy, may all beings be true, thereby extending the blessing to the whole world. Options. These are all options. But really, you need not say anything at all. With the hustle of our days, once we've all finally gathered around the table, or even if it's a table for one, it is a radical act enough to simply take a collective or solitary pause, a moment of silence, light a chalice, hold hands, or hold your own hands, and take a breath before beginning your meal. One way to combat the anxiety caused by social media is to generate more opportunities for mental silence throughout your day. Another way to connect with divine, with faith, is of course prayer, which is central to all stories of survival against the odds. It's the voice crying out into the wilderness, Job's lament to God, his surrender to a force greater than anything else. You know, even in detention on our Arizona border, one woman who was interviewed about her experience being forced to live apart from her young child She talked about prayer as the one spot of light in her bleak experience. Her name is Mayra, and she is escaping gang violence from Honduras. Though most of the details of her life in our detention facilities are shockingly horrific, to be honest, she did tell this USA Today reporter that there have been some good moments inside detention. The moment when the women, even the ones who speak very little Spanish, all gather round and hold hands across the tables in the visitors' room, praying. Another way you can connect with this practice, this spiritual discipline of tending to your relationship with the divine, is through daily meditation. And so I would like to make a collective offering to you. When we leave this building, Reverend McCarr and I will begin offering a daily meditation for you to receive via social media or even via text if you opt into that. This will be a morning meditation to help you begin your day inspired, ready to throw yourself like seed as you walk and into your own field, as the poet Miguel de Unamuno suggests. I hope you will choose to opt in to receive this morning meditation from us, and I'm excited to offer this to you so that you might use it to build your altar within. Connecting with the divine. You can also do this through the spiritual practice of reading, and I know many Unitarian Universalists like to read. It's something we are somewhat known for. So reading as a spiritual practice, how do you do this? This is how I stay involved in the events of the world. I am not a news junkie, but I do have a deep desire to stay engaged, to know what's going on, and I do it through reading stories. I try to read the stories of people who share some aspect of my experience, but are also suffering in ways that I am not. Lately, this is why I'm reading firsthand accounts of women who are mothers, like me, but unlike me, are living in detention facilities around our country and are separated from their children. I read their stories as a spiritual discipline to learn from them how they are surviving and to understand their lived experience. Now, this spiritual practice of reading stories is more painful than just skimming over a headline so that I might emit a satisfying harumph or a dramatic gasp. Did you see? But this is how I find truth amidst a complex web of deception that defines our government's use of media. You know, Vice President of Auburn Seminary, Mackie Alston, calls this seeking in the life-dealing truths. He says, we are vessels of truth-telling, and the work of knowing what those life-dealing truths are and the delivery of those messages to the world, that is beautiful, sacred work. And if we take that assignment seriously, the life-dealing truths, sometimes they come in the form of confessions. Then it would be poetry, it would be art, it would feel like ritual and prayer, and we would value each other's existence more deeply. And so when I read as a spiritual practice, I am intentionally seeking the life-dealing truths. Now, as Unitarian Universalists, we have a special relationship that can frame our devotional life, and that is our relationship with wonderment. And last week from this pulpit, I named my dream that Unitarian Universalists the world over would become known for being truly skilled, amazing listeners. Quaker educator Parker Palmer tells us, if we want to support each other's inner lives, we must remember a simple truth. The human soul does not want to be fixed. It simply wants to be seen and heard. And so a spiritual discipline of deep listening leads us away from judgment, away from assumptions, and away from the collective attention deficit that defines our time, and leads us back towards truth, towards surrendering to wonder and awe. Another way to practice our relationship with wonderment is to practice awakeness, attention to awakeness. Now, there's a lot of talk these days about wokeness being a destination or an end. like as though we are not all students to our own limitations, constantly waking up to the ways we benefit from systems that oppress others. To live spiritually is to be attentive and awake all the time to the experiences of others, and to awaken to all we don't know, humbly residing in wonderment, curiosity. A spiritual practice for UUs to connect to that first source of direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder which moves us to renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. So if we live with a spiritual practice of staying awake to wonder, then no matter the age of our bodies, we continually awaken with our spirits renewed. Wow, I didn't know that. Our relationship with ancestors. I have a friend who moves around a lot, but everywhere she has lived, the first box she unpacks is marked ancestors. She sets up a small table, unfurls a beautiful white tablecloth, and creates her altar of ancestors featuring photographs, a few letters, and a candle in the middle, and her ancestors travel everywhere with her. She connects with them each day, lighting her candle and taking a moment to be with them. I was reminded of this practice when I recently saw the Disney film Coco, based on Dia de los Muertos. It's a beautiful film if you haven't seen it. I lived in Mexico during Dia de los Muertos, and I was enchanted by the joy and the power of ancestral communication. And on All Souls Day, or All Saints Day, I would actually love for UU churches everywhere to bring photos of the deceased that have been a part of the community and to place it on an altar, honoring the wider community of ancestors who bless all who worship here. But you can make an altar in your home. Place sacred objects on this altar. Create a reflection, a visual reflection of your inner life. Make it a container for your dreams, your desires, your tears, your lamentation. And finally, a spiritual practice to honor the relationship with family and community. Last Sunday, we talked here about neighborhoods and villes. Honoring your ville, you can honor your ville through the spiritual practice of service. Create a living prayer by providing a service to someone in your neighborhood each week. Now, many of you are already doing this. Since last week, so many of you have shared your stories with me of your neighborhood service, acts of service, and together we have delighted in the practice of being a living prayer, being of service. This is a time where just kindness, civility, and being a good neighbor is radical. Another way that you can create a spiritual practice with your community is through a sangha, a prayer group, a meditation group. This can spring up out of sheer necessity. I remember the summer that I was doing my clinical pastoral residency, and once a week I spent in the psychiatric unit. One day, a patient I worked with asked if I would lead a guided meditation for her. It was the only thing, she said, that could calm her considerable anxiety and her manic mind. And I sat in the center of the room and I led a 10-minute guided meditation for her. Eventually, her roommate came in, and a couple of minutes later, another neighbor down the hall joined us. Well, next week I came back, and now 5 people sat in her room, ready to sit with me in guided meditation. The following week, the numbers had doubled, and there were 10 people with phenomenally different diagnoses, all awaiting my arrival. This went on week after week. I would lead guided meditation for almost the entire unit. We eventually had to switch to a different room and ask permission to gather with such a large group of patients. And so we meditated together, mostly in silence. Our physical bodies were locked behind doors and shut in. And for many people in that room, they were also unable to experience mental freedom, freedom from medication or thoughts that conspired to create another kind of prison. And together we breathed, and we walked down a path in our minds, up a mountain, and for a few minutes, we were free. See, the altar is a container to cry, to lament, the altar within. There are myriad ways to resist. Not just resist an oppressive administration, but resist getting lost in overwhelm. Resist the urge to rest in ignorance and oblivion. Resist bitterness. Resist helplessness. Resist skimming headlines. Make a little altar in your heart or in your actual home and find a way to return to that altar, tend to it, fill it with meaning. You'll hear me say again and again that we should pray with our feet, that we should get up and we should do something and take action, and that is still true. But in order to give your actions integrity, in order to act like a Unitarian Universalist, to give it depth and meaning, we must also nourish our spirit. And so in those moments when the stakes are high, when your faith is truly tested, you will know it's there. We will resist, yes, and with a foundation of spiritual depth. May I be light to those in darkness, food to the hungry. May I be the alarm clock, the wake-up call, the morning cup of coffee for those who would need to awaken. This is how we survive.